You're coming with us. We need a daddy like you. That's what the two little voices said, out on a frozen trail, high in the Colorado Pass, where the wind bites and the world feels empty. A lonely mountain man named Ezekiel Boone stopped his mule, snow clinging to his beard like crystals, and he saw them. Two small girls, maybe 8 years old, with identical china blue eyes. They wore thin coats that were no match for the cold, but their gaze was filled with a stubborn, unbreakable hope. Zeke thought he'd just tip his hat and ride on. He was a man who kept to himself, a man who had his reasons. He was wrong, dead wrong. What waited for him in their leaning, desperate cabin was worse than any storm he'd ever faced. A mother fading like a candle in the wind, a fire dying to embers, and a silence that screamed of abandonment. But that wasn't the worst of it. The real trouble came with the law, not to help, but to take, to ship the girls on an orphan train east, far from the only home they'd ever known, far from the mountains that held their blood. Now with a greedy railroad sniffing at their land and the town whispering poison about their family, one quiet man had to make a choice. Turn his back again, like he had on the whole world, or stand like a father when the wolves, both two-legged and four, began to circle. Because sometimes the biggest fight isn't with a gun in your hand. It's with the fear in your heart, the fear of loving something and losing it all over again. Every story brings us a little closer together. Before we dive into this one, do me a favor and drop a comment with where you're listening from. It's a real joy to see how far this family of listeners reaches. The winter wind howled through the high country, a lonely sound that Zeke Boone knew better than his own name. It whipped snow across the trail in stinging flurries, dusting the pines until they looked like ghosts. He hunched deeper into his worn wool coat, the leather of his saddle creaking a familiar rhythm. His mule, Betsy, plodded forward, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The bags slung across her back were heavy with a month's worth of life: flour, beans, salt pork, lamp oil, enough to keep the solitude at bay. Zeke's face was a roadmap of hard years, lined by sun and wind, and a grief he never spoke of. At 45, the hair at his temples was turning the color of ash, a perfect match for the sky overhead. For 15 years, the creak of leather and the whisper of the wind had been his only conversation. He preferred it that way. Silence couldn't break your heart. Then he saw them. Near a bend where the creek was frozen solid, two small figures stood planted in the middle of the trail. Zeke blinked, thinking the cold was playing tricks on his eyes, summoning ghosts of a different time. But they were real. Two girls identical as two fresh-minted pennies, peering out from beneath hoods of mismatched, threadbare coats. Betsy stopped short, sensing the shift in her rider. The girls didn't move. They just stood there, their worn boots making tiny prints in the snow, their blue eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. "You're coming with us," one of them announced. Her voice was small but carried the weight of a judge's gavel. The other one nodded, her chin lifted with the same impossible certainty. "We need a daddy like you." The word daddy hit Zeke like a physical blow. It was a word from another life, a word he had packed away and buried deep in the frozen ground of his memory. He opened his mouth to tell them no, to tell them to find someone else, that he was the wrong man for any job that involved hope. But his voice, rough from disuse, caught in his throat. He just stared, the wind whipping around them, the silence stretching thin and tight. The first girl took a step forward, her expression unwavering. "Our mama's sick," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "Real sick." The second one chimed in, her words a mirror image of her sister's. "And we ain't got nobody else." Zeke's fingers, numb with cold, tightened on the leather reins. He forced the words out, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Where's your pa?" They answered in perfect, chilling unison. "In heaven." The words hung in the frosty air, a statement of fact as cold and hard as the packed earth beneath their feet. He tried to steer Betsy around them, to just get away, to get back to the quiet of his cabin, where the past couldn't find him. But they were quick, moving like a pair of winter wrens to block his path again. The look in their eyes, that fierce, unyielding blue, reminded him of a mountain river in the spring thaw. There was no stopping it. There was no turning it aside. It went where it wanted to go. Please, the first twin said, and for the first time her voice cracked, a tiny fissure in that wall of determination. She reached up a small, mittened hand and touched the toe of his boot. The mitten was patched with 3 different colors of yarn. Mama's coughing something awful. She says the shadows are getting closer. Zeke looked down the trail toward the cold comfort of his empty cabin. Then he looked back at the 2 small, worried faces, their cheeks red and raw from the wind. And in that moment, something inside him, something that had been frozen solid for 15 long years, began to groan and shift. It was the sound of ice breaking up in a long overdue spring. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a white cloud that vanished into the gray air. With a grunt of resignation that seemed to come from the very soles of his feet, he swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted. "Show me," he said. And with those 2 words, the carefully constructed solitude of his life began to crumble. They led him off the main trail, down a path so faint it was little more than a memory in the snow. The cabin they brought him to leaned to one side, as if it were tired of fighting the wind and had decided to just give in. Smoke, thin and weak as a dying breath, curled from the stone chimney. It was a place that felt like it was already giving up. The moment Zeke stepped inside, the air hit him. It was thick and heavy, a sweet, sharp smell of sickness that clung to the back of his throat, mixed with the damp chill of a fire fighting a losing battle. A woman lay on a narrow cot in the corner, buried under a patchwork of thin quilts. Her face was as pale as fresh milk, except for 2 unnaturally bright spots of color high on her cheekbones. Her dark hair was splayed across a lumpy pillow, and her breathing was a ragged, painful pull that made Zeke's own chest ache in sympathy. She tried to sit up, a violent cough shaking her frail frame. "I'm Clara Dawes," she managed to rasp, her voice a ghost of what it once must have been. I'm sorry if my girls bothered you, Mr. Boone," he supplied, his voice low. "Ezekiel Boone. Folks call me Zeke." He set his heavy supply bags down on the rough-hewn table, his eyes taking in the bare shelves, the empty water bucket, the profound lack of life in the small room. "Your girls are persistent." A faint smile touched Clara's chapped lips. "That they are. Lydia and Lahi, they have their own minds about things." The twins, Lydia and Lahi, were already unpacking his supplies, their small hands moving with a practiced efficiency that was heartbreaking to watch. They laid out the flour, the beans, the coffee, lining them up on the table like priceless treasures. Zeke watched them for a moment, a knot tightening in his gut. Then without a word, he turned and went back outside. The crisp, clean air was a relief. Behind the cabin, he found a small pile of uncut logs, half buried in the snow. The sound of his axe soon echoed through the clearing, a sharp, steady rhythm of purpose in the oppressive quiet. The girls appeared with a pot. He took it from them and crunched down to the creek, breaking through a thin crust of ice to reach the dark, flowing water beneath. Back inside, he didn't stop until the fire in the hearth was roaring, its flames a hungry, vibrant orange, pushing the cold and the shadows back into the corners. He could already see the difference. The warmth seemed to ease the tightness in Clara's chest, and her ragged breaths came a little easier. The twins moved around the small space with a quiet competence that spoke of long, hard months of being the caregivers, of being old before their time. The sight of it twisted something deep inside him. The short winter day was already surrendering to a bruised purple dusk when Zeke finally straightened up. He had chopped enough wood to last them a few days, filled their water bucket, and made sure the fire was safely banked. "That ought to hold you for a while," he said, his voice gruff as he reached for his coat. "Thank you kindly," Clara whispered from the bed. Her eyes, clearer now in the firelight, watched him with a mixture of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite decipher. It looked almost like assessment. The twins followed him outside into the biting cold. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of silent demand. "You'll come back," Lydia said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Zeke swung himself up onto his mule, the cold leather groaning under his weight. He looked down at their 2 identical, upturned faces, lit by the faint glow from the cabin window. For a moment he didn't know what to say. He was a man of the mountains, a man of silence. He wasn't built for this, for these kinds of expectations. He just touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was neither a yes nor a no, and turned Betsy toward home. He could feel their eyes on his back the entire way to the bend in the trail. Just as he was about to disappear from their sight, he heard one of them, he couldn't tell which, say clear as a bell in the still air, "Told you he was the right one." The words chased him all the way back to his cabin. When he stepped inside, the silence that had once been his comfort now felt vast and heavy. It pressed in on him, thick with the echoes of two little girls' voices and the memory of their unshakable belief. He went about his nightly chores by rote, banking his own fire, feeding Betsy, setting water to boil. But his mind wasn't there. It was back in that leaning cabin, with the sick woman and her two fiercely determined daughters. He stood in his doorway for a long time, watching the darkness swallow the mountains, a gnawing certainty growing in his gut. Those two little girls hadn't just blocked his path. They had just rerouted the entire course of his life, like a spring flood carving a new, unexpected canyon through the wilderness. And he had a terrible feeling that the floodwaters were still rising. Morning sunlight, thin and white, filtered through the frost-etched windows of Zeke's cabin. He sat at his table, his calloused fingers working with practiced ease to mend a broken bridle strap. The familiar task, the smell of leather and wax, usually brought him a sense of peace, a quiet order. But today his mind was a tangle of blue eyes and ragged coughs. His solitude felt less like a choice and more like a cage. He was just finishing the last stitch when he heard it, the crunch of hooves in the snow, an unfamiliar sound, a visitor. Zeke's head snapped up. He set his work aside and moved to the door, his hand resting near the heavy iron poker by the hearth out of pure instinct. He opened the door just as Constable Morris was dismounting his bay horse. The lawman's badge glinted in the morning light. "Boone?" Morris nodded, his face grim as he stamped the snow from his boots. "Heard you met the Dawes girls yesterday." "News travels fast in the high country," Zeke said, his voice flat. He stepped back, letting the constable inside. The small man seemed to fill the cabin's silence with an unwelcome authority. "Had to bring you word," Morris said, warming his hands by the potbelly stove. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Clara Dawes took a turn for the worse before dawn. Reverend Kane and his wife moved her to the church infirmary in town. He paused, his sharp little eyes watching Zeke's reaction. "The doctor's with her now, but it doesn't look good." Zeke's hand tightened on the back of a chair. He felt a strange, unwelcome lurch in his stomach. "The girls. That's the other thing." Morris let out a heavy sigh, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "With no kin to speak of, they're wards of the county now. There's an orphan train heading east in a month's time. They'll be on it. Chances are good they'll find proper homes back in Pennsylvania or Ohio." The word homes echoed in the small cabin, sounding hollow and wrong. Zeke remembered the way Lydia and Lahi had stood together, a fortress of two. He remembered the fierce love in their eyes when they spoke of their mother. "They got a home," he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "Funny you should mention that." The constable's expression turned serious, almost accusatory. "Those little spitfires are telling anyone who'll listen that you're their chosen father. Say it like it's already a settled fact," causing quite a stir. Zeke turned away, pretending to adjust the stove damper. The back of his neck felt hot. "Kids, they don't know what they're saying." "Maybe not," Morris said, his voice dropping. "But the thing is, Boone, their pa, Samuel, he wasn't well liked. Not by everyone. Kept to himself, but there were whispers about his blood, about him thinking that land was more his than anyone else's." The constable's eyes narrowed. "His death out on that ridge last fall ruled an accident, a fall. But I always had my doubts, always felt like something was off. This was new, a sickness, a dead father, an accident that might not have been an accident." The story was getting darker, its edges sharper. "If you're of a mind to do something about those girls," Morris continued, changing the subject so abruptly it felt like a warning, "you'd need to file a petition with Judge Halbrook. He'd want proof of a respectable household, mind you, proper arrangements for their schooling and such. And he'd look hard at a man like you, a man with no ties, a man who keeps to himself. The implication was clear. You're not the right kind of man. I ain't fit for family, Zeke said, the words tasting like ash. Living alone suits me. Morris put his hat back on, his message delivered. Maybe so, but those girls seem mighty sure about you, Boone. He moved toward the door, then paused, his hand on the latch. And another thing, the Western Railroad Company had surveyors up on that ridge just last week, right near the Dawes claim. Seems they're planning a new depot. That land just became mighty valuable. He let that hang in the air for a moment. Judge holds court Tuesdays and Thursdays, if you change your mind. Zeke watched the constable ride away until he was just a speck against the snow. He went back to his leather work, but his hands wouldn't steady. The constable hadn't just brought news, he'd brought threats, an orphan train, a suspicious death, a railroad. Suddenly, the girl's fierce declaration, "We need a daddy like you," sounded less like a child's wish and more like a desperate plea for a protector. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The cabin, his sanctuary, felt like a trap. The shadows in the corners seemed to lengthen and twist, filled with unwanted memories. His wife, Sarah, her laugh like summer sunshine. Their infant son, Daniel, his tiny hand curled around Zeke's thumb. The fever that had swept through their small homestead like a fire, taking them both in one cruel, merciless week. He'd fled after that, running to these mountains to build a life walled off from love and loss. For 15 years, that wall had held. Now 2 little girls had found a crack in it, and a whole world of trouble was trying to pour through. He tossed in his narrow bed, haunted by their voices, by the constable's warnings, by the shadow of a railroad stretching over a dead man's land. By first light, he knew he couldn't stay here. He couldn't hide. He saddled Betsy, his movements jerky and agitated. The crisp morning air bit at his face as he rode toward town, toward the church spire just visible on the horizon. He didn't know what he was going to do. He just knew he couldn't do nothing. He kept telling himself they weren't his problem. But as he rode, he could almost hear them. Told you he was the right one. He was starting to fear they were right. The town of Redemption Pass was a single snow-packed street carved out of the wilderness. Shop doors creaked open and shut, releasing puffs of warm, spice-scented air. The rhythmic click of the telegraph office sounded like a nervous heartbeat. To Zeke, who had spent years listening only to the wind, it was a cacophony. He tied Betsy to the hitching post outside the white-steepled church and took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. This was a world he had left behind. He wasn't sure he remembered how to navigate it. He found them in the infirmary wing, a long, quiet room that smelled of disinfectant and boiled linens. Clara Dawes was propped up on pillows, her face shockingly pale against the starched white sheets, but her eyes were clear and alert, and they were fixed on her daughters, who were perched on wooden stools beside her bed like 2 small guardian angels. They spotted him the moment he stepped through the door. "Daddy came," Lydia and Lahi chorused, their faces breaking into identical, radiant grins. They scrambled off their stools and rushed toward him. The words spoken so loudly in the quiet room drew the attention of everyone. A nurse paused with a tray. Reverend Kane, a tall man with a kind, weary face, looked up from the ledger he was writing in. "Mr. Boone," the pastor said, his voice a mixture of surprise and cautious approval. "The girls were certain you would come." Zeke felt a dozen pairs of eyes on him. He took off his hat, feeling clumsy and out of place. The small room was thick with expectations he had no idea how to meet. Lahi grabbed his rough, calloused hand, her small fingers warm and trusting. "We told Mama you would," she said, looking up at him with those impossibly blue eyes. "The county has specific requirements for guardianship," Reverend Kane said, moving closer. His tone was gentle but firm. "Moral character must be demonstrated, a proper home provided. These girls need schooling, guidance, stability." "I never asked this of you, Mr. Boone," Clara interrupted from the bed. Her voice was a fragile whisper, but her gaze was direct and strong. "The girls, they have their own ideas. A harsh cough seized her, shaking her thin frame. Lydia immediately darted back to her side, patting her hand. "We chose him, Mama," Lydia said fiercely. "He's perfect. He brought us wood yesterday, and water." She looked at Zeke, her expression one of absolute faith. "And he made the fire warm again." Zeke looked from their hopeful faces to their mother's worried one, and then to the pastor's watchful eyes. The weight of their combined trust was a physical pressure in his chest. "Reckon I should talk to the judge," he heard himself say. The decision was made not in his head, but somewhere deeper, in a place he thought had died long ago. Relief, pure and profound, washed over Clara's pale features. "They're good girls, mister Boone," she whispered. "But they need more than I can give them right now." Judge Halbrook's office was a cramped room above the general store, filled with dusty law books and the faint scent of stale cigars. The judge was a stern-looking man with a fringe of white hair and eyes that seemed to see right through a man's defenses. Zeke stood before his desk and explained the situation, his words simple and direct. He left out the constable's suspicions and the railroad. For now, this was just about the girls. The judge listened without interruption, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Temporary guardianship is possible," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. 60 days, a probationary period, to prove you can provide a proper home and raising. He pulled out a stack of official-looking papers. "You'll need references, proof of income from your trapping, and you will ensure these girls are receiving education and moral instruction. That means church and school." The judge's pen scratched across the documents, the sound loud in the quiet room. "Mind you, Mr. Boone," he said, looking up at Zeke over his spectacles, "this arrangement can be revoked at any time if the requirements are not met, or if a more suitable placement is found." The threat of the orphan train was unspoken, but it hung in the air. "Those girls deserve stability. Can you provide that?" It was a question Zeke couldn't answer, but he signed the papers anyway. When he returned to the infirmary, the twins were waiting, their few belongings packed into 2 small carpet bags. It was a heartbreakingly small pile of possessions. Clara reached for his hand as he approached her bed. Her fingers felt as fragile as a bird's bones against his rough palm. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears, "for giving them a chance." "We'll come see you," he promised, his voice thick, "soon as you're stronger." The journey back to his cabin felt different. He was no longer a man returning to his solitude. He was a guardian, a temporary father. Lydia shared his saddle, her small body tucked in front of him, while Lahi rode Betsy's broad back, clutching the saddle horn. Their chatter filled the forest, a constant stream of questions that he was ill-equipped to answer. "Do you have chickens? Can we plant a garden when the snow melts? Are there bears near your cabin? Will you teach us to fish?" He answered as best he could, but with every question, he became more aware of how sparse his life was, how little he had to offer. When they finally reached his cabin, it looked different to him. Not a sanctuary, but a shabby, lonely little box against the vast wilderness. Dusk was falling, and its windows were dark and unwelcoming. Inside, the fire had died, leaving a chill in the air. While Zeke lit the lamps and coaxed a new fire to life, the girls explored the single room that was to be their new home. They were quiet for the first time all day. "Where will we sleep?" Lydia finally asked, her eyes on the single narrow bed in the corner. Zeke looked at his sparse furnishings, a fresh wave of inadequacy washing over him. I'll make up pallets by the fire for tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we'll sort out proper arrangements." The reality of what he had done was settling in, heavy and inexorable. He was responsible for them, for their warmth, their food, their safety. He watched them unpack their meager belongings, a few worn dresses, a hairbrush, a single much-loved rag doll. The walls of his carefully constructed solitude weren't just crumbling, they had been leveled. Then Lahi looked up at him, her expression one of complete and utter trust, without a shadow of a doubt. "What's for supper, Daddy?" she asked. And in that moment, Zeke knew. There was no going back, not ever. Zeke stirred the pot of beans bubbling on the cast-iron stove, adding a pinch of salt. The familiar, simple motion felt alien with two pairs of curious blue eyes watching his every move. "Can we help?" Lydia asked, practically vibrating with an energy that seemed to fill the small cabin. "Mama taught us how to cook." "Reckon you could mix up the cornbread," Zeke said, gesturing to the flour sack and his mother's old ceramic bowl. Before he could give any instructions, both girls lunged for the flour at once. A white cloud erupted, dusting their hair, their faces, and a good portion of the rough, wooden floor. A moment of stunned silence, and then they burst into peals of laughter. The sound was so bright and unexpected, it seemed to echo off the log walls, chasing away years of accumulated silence. Zeke found himself fighting a smile as he handed them a rag. It was a losing battle. "Sorry," Lahi said, a grin still splitting her flour-dusted face. "We'll do better next time." Next time. The words settled in his chest, warm as a banked fire. The dinner of beans and slightly lopsided cornbread was the best meal Zeke had eaten in 15 years. The twins' chatter filled the spaces between bites, stories about their mama, their old cabin, the horse their papa had trained. They ate with the hearty appetites of healthy children, and for the first time, Zeke's cabin didn't feel empty. When the last dish was washed and dried, he led them to the sleeping loft, a space he'd never used himself. He hauled up his spare quilts, the ones that still smelled faintly of the cedar chest they'd been stored in, and showed them how to make warm pallets on the floorboards. "It ain't much," he said, his voice gruff with an emotion he couldn't name, "but it'll keep you warm." "It's perfect," Lydia declared, already wrapping herself in a faded blue quilt. "We can see the stars through the roof," Lahi whispered in awe, pointing to a tiny gap between the boards. Zeke climbed back down the ladder, leaving them to their soft whispers, which soon faded into the steady rhythm of sleep. He stretched out on his own narrow bed, but for a long time he just listened to the sound of them breathing. The cabin felt different. It felt occupied, alive. He was jolted awake at dawn by a sharp, acrid smell. Burning. He shot out of bed and found the twins crouched by the hearth, a plume of black smoke curling up from his battered coffee pot. Coffee grounds were scattered across the stones. "We wanted to make you breakfast," Lydia explained, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with apology. "Like Mama does." A shadow crossed her face. "Like Mama did," Lahi corrected softly. Instead of scolding, Zeke knelt beside them. He gently took the pot and showed them how to measure the coffee, how to pour the water, how to nestle it in the coals just right. Soon, the familiar, comforting aroma of brewing coffee filled the cabin, chasing away the burnt smell. He taught them how to make porridge, how they watched his hands, mimicking his every move. They were desperate to learn, to be useful, desperate for a routine. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, one dictated by the boundless energy of two 8-year-old girls. His quiet, orderly life was turned upside down. They swept the floor with an old broom, their vigorous efforts often stirring up more dust than they collected. They insisted on arranging pine boughs on the windowsills, bringing the fresh, sharp scent of the forest inside. They followed him everywhere, a constant stream of questions in their wake. "How far can your rifle shoot? Do the animals get scared in your traps? Were you in the war? Were you brave?" He answered what he could and sidestepped what he couldn't. He found himself talking more than he had in a decade, the sound of his own voice strange in his ears. More surprising still was how often he caught himself smiling, at their lopsided attempts to fold his spare shirt, at their shrieks of delight when they spotted deer tracks in the snow, at the way they finished each other's sentences without even noticing. On the 5th day, another visitor arrived. This time it was Deacon Mills from the church, a stern man in a formal black coat that looked out of place against the wilderness. The twins instinctively pressed close to Zeke's side as the deacon entered, his eyes scanning the cabin with a critical air. "Judge Halbrook sent me," the deacon announced without preamble, pulling out a small notebook, "to inspect the living conditions." His gaze lingered on the single bed, the sparse furnishings, the pallets in the loft. His pencil scratched across the page. Zeke's jaw tightened. He felt like a specimen under glass. The deacon turned his cold eyes on the girls. "Are you being properly cared for?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. "Oh yes, sir," Lydia said immediately, her voice firm. "Zeke teaches us things. Every day. He made sure we had enough quilts," Lahi added, her small hand finding Zeke's and squeezing it tight. "And he never forgets to stoke the fire at night, so we don't get cold." The deacon's expression softened, just a fraction. He looked at their clean faces, their bright eyes, the way they stood protectively by Zeke's side. "They seem content," he conceded, making a final note. "Though the accommodations are rustic, to say the least, there is much room for improvement." After the deacon left, a restless energy seized Zeke. The judgment, the feeling of being watched and weighed had unsettled him. He saw his home through the deacon's eyes, and it felt lacking, inadequate. The girls sensed his mood and grew quiet, their usual boisterous energy subdued. As evening fell, Zeke pulled out his mending basket. "Here," he said, his voice rough. "Time you learned something useful." He showed them how to thread a needle, how to push it through the thick wool of a worn sock, how to make small, neat stitches. Their first attempts were clumsy, their fingers fumbling, but they persisted, their faces screwed up in concentration. Slowly, as they worked by the flickering firelight, the quiet tension in the cabin eased. Laughter returned as Lydia told a silly joke, making Lahi giggle so hard she pricked her finger. Zeke watched them, their dark and light heads bent so intently over their task. His cabin wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was changing, day by day. The pine boughs, the girls' few belongings carefully arranged on a shelf, their laughter echoing in the rafters. It was becoming something else. It was becoming a home. The thought should have terrified him. He had run from that word, from everything it meant. But as he knelt to help Lahi untangle her thread, he felt something he hadn't felt in a lifetime. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was the beginning of a thaw, a slow, painful, and terrifying thaw in the frozen landscape of his heart. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that the 60 days the judge had given him wouldn't be nearly enough. He was already in too deep. The first Sunday arrived, sharp and bright, the sunlight glinting off a fresh layer of snow. Zeke, who hadn't seen the inside of a church since he'd buried his wife and son, found himself polishing his old cavalry boots. He put on his one good shirt, a faded blue cotton he'd pressed smooth with a heated iron. The judge's words had been clear. Moral instruction, and that meant church. The twins emerged from the cabin wearing their best dresses, their hair neatly braided by their own small, clever hands. They looked like two proper little ladies, and the sight sent a strange pang through Zeke's chest. "Ready?" he asked, adjusting the blankets in the wooden sled he'd hitched to Betsy. "We haven't been since Mama got real sick," Lydia said, her voice small as she climbed in. "Will everyone stare at us?" "Let 'em stare," Zeke said gruffly, though his own stomach was twisted into a knot at the thought of facing the whole town. The church bell was ringing as they pulled up, its clear notes echoing in the cold air. Inside, the warmth from two pot-bellied stoves wrapped around them like a blanket. The pews gleamed, and light streamed through tall, arched windows. As Zeke led the girls to an empty bench near the back, he felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes. Whispers drifted through the air like falling leaves. At first they were friendly enough. How was their mother? Didn't the girls look well? Then the tone shifted. "Heard tell their pa was half Comanche," a woman murmured 2 pews ahead. "That's why he never fit in. Ran with his own people right up until he died." "And now that widow's lost her land claim," another voice added, low and smug. "The railroad bought it up. Legal and proper. Good riddance, I say." Zeke's jaw tightened. He felt the girls stiffen beside him. They were pretending to read their hymnals, but he knew they'd heard. He saw Lydia's small fingers tracing the same word over and over. The service felt like it lasted an eternity. The pastor's words about charity and loving thy neighbor sounded hollow and hypocritical. When the final amen was said, Zeke ushered the girls outside as quickly as he could, but they weren't fast enough. As they crossed the street toward the general store, a man named Henderson, a rancher with a mean streak, deliberately spat a wad of tobacco into the snow near their feet. "Ain't right," he muttered, just loud enough for them to hear. "A man like Boone, taking in half-breed cast-offs, ought to be with their own kind." Before the girls could even react, something inside Zeke snapped. The quiet, solitary mountain man vanished. In his place stood someone colder, harder. He spun around, his voice low and dangerous, like the rumble of a distant rockslide. "Those girls," he said, his eyes locking with Henderson's, "are exactly where they belong. Their mother is a fine woman, and their pa was a good man who died protecting what was his." He took a step closer, and Henderson, for all his bluster, took a step back. "I won't hear another word against them. Is that clear?" The man's face turned red, but he dropped his gaze and shuffled away without another word. The small crowd that had gathered to watch quickly dispersed. Zeke put a steadying hand on Lahi's shoulder. She was trembling. Inside the store, the whispers followed them, but no one dared speak to his face. He bought sugar, coffee, and a small bag of dried apples for Clara, his movements stiff with anger. The girls stayed glued to his side, their usual bright chatter extinguished. At the infirmary, they found Clara sitting up in bed, a little more color in her cheeks. Her face lit up when the girls rushed to hug her, but her smile faded when she saw their subdued expressions and the storm still brewing in Zeke's eyes. While the twins told her about the hymns, carefully omitting the ugliness outside, Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife, quietly pulled Zeke aside. "I saw what happened with Mr. Henderson," she whispered, her kind face troubled. "Thank you for standing up for them, Mr. Boone. Not many would have." Zeke just nodded, the knot in his stomach loosening just a bit. They left as the snow began to fall again, thick, heavy flakes that promised to blanket the world in white. The journey home was slow, the sled's runners dragging in the fresh powder. The twins were quiet, huddled under the blankets. Then soft and clear, one of them began to sing. A hymn their mother had taught them. "Amazing Grace." How sweet the sound. The other voice joined in, a perfect, sweet harmony that floated out over the white landscape. "That saved a wretch like me." Zeke listened, the simple, beautiful sound washing over him. The anger began to recede, replaced by something else, a fierce, protective fire. He'd lived his life avoiding trouble, avoiding connection. But Henderson's ugly words, the town's casual cruelty, had shown him something. Protecting these girls wasn't just about food and shelter. It was about defending their honor, their very right to exist. He had drawn a line in the snow, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the railroad, the whispers, the whole damn town could try to cross it. He would be waiting for them. The wretch, he realized, was him, and these two little girls, with their simple, unshakable faith, were saving him. Early December buried the high country in snow. The days grew short, the nights long and cold. Inside the cabin, a new kind of warmth had taken root, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire roaring in the hearth. It was the warmth of routine, of shared purpose. "Mind your fingers now," Zeke instructed, his large hand guiding Lydia's small one as she held the kindling axe. "Let the weight of the axe do the work." The piece of pine split with a satisfying crack. "My turn." Lahi bounced on her toes, eager. "Steady," Zeke cautioned. "Ain't no rush when you're working with sharp things." They spent the morning learning the rhythm of chores, splitting kindling, checking the rabbit snares he'd taught them to set, patching a small leak in the roof with pine tar and shaking hands. They were quick learners, their minds like sponges, their hands eager to help. "Mama always said we need to learn everything," Lydia explained, her face serious as she examined her tar-stained fingers, "so we can take care of ourselves proper." The words spoken with such childish gravity made Zeke's chest ache. Later that afternoon, they insisted on teaching him their mother's biscuit recipe. They giggled at his clumsy, flour-covered hands. "No, no," Lahi corrected, taking his large hand in both of hers. "You got to work the butter and gentle like, or they'll come out tough as boot leather." "Your mama taught you all this?" Zeke asked, humbled by their skill. "Every Sunday," Lydia said. "She says cooking is like a prayer. You got to put your whole heart in it." The biscuits came out lopsided, but they were the best he'd ever tasted. As they ate, a thought began to form in Zeke's mind, a fragile idea that he was almost afraid to examine too closely. The 60-day guardianship was ticking away. Soon the judge would decide their fate, and Clara. Clara was getting stronger, but she had no home to return to. The railroad had seen to that. The next market day, they loaded his winter pelts onto the sled. The beaver and fox furs fetched a fair price at the general store, enough for sturdy new winter boots for the girls to replace their worn-out ones, and enough for a bolt of thick, deep blue wool cloth. Just like Mama's eyes, Lahi declared. While the girls were admiring the fabric, the store owner, Mr. Peterson, called Zeke aside. He looked nervous. "Telegram came from Mrs. Dawes," he said quietly, holding out a familiar yellow envelope. "Figured it was best to give it to you." Zeke's blood ran cold. Telegrams rarely brought good news. He tucked it deep into his coat pocket, a small, square weight against his ribs. They found Clara at the infirmary, sitting in a chair by the window, a book in her lap. She looked stronger, more like herself. The girls rushed to show her their new boots and the fabric, their excitement a tangible thing in the quiet room. "My, what fine things," she smiled, her fingers tracing the soft wool. Zeke waited until the girls were distracted by a nurse. Then he pulled out the envelope. "This came for you," he said, his voice low. Clara's smile vanished. Her face went carefully neutral as she took the telegram. Her fingers, he noticed, trembled slightly as she opened it. She read the single line of text, and all the newfound color drained from her cheeks. She folded it quickly, tucking it into her apron pocket before the girls could see. "What is it, Mama?" Lydia asked, sensing the change in the air. Just word from an old friend," Clara said, her voice a little too bright. "Nothing to worry about." But Zeke saw the look in her eyes. It was fear, pure, unadulterated fear. And he knew with a sinking certainty that whatever was in that telegram, it wasn't from an old friend. It was a threat, and it was coming for them. That evening, back at the cabin, the girls begged for a story. Zeke settled into his chair by the fire, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He told them a story his own father had told him about a hard winter when their family had taken in strangers, sharing what little they had. "My pa always said," Zeke's voice grew soft, the memory sharp and clear, "that sometimes the good Lord puts folks in our path so we can be his hands here on earth." He looked at the two girls, their faces sleepy and content in the firelight, and the truth of those words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He thought he was helping them, but the truth was, they were saving him. They were teaching him how to be human again. And as they drifted off to sleep, Zeke made a silent vow. He didn't know who had sent that telegram or what new danger it represented. But he knew this. No one was going to harm this fragile, budding family. He would be his father's son. He would be God's hands. And if necessary, those hands would not be gentle. Christmas Eve morning dawned so clear and cold the air seemed to crackle. Zeke and the twins tramped through the snow to a stand of young pines to find the perfect tree. They settled on a small, perfectly shaped fir, and the fresh scent of pine filled the cabin as they set it up in the corner. They decorated it with paper chains they had glued together, strings of dried red berries, and a single small tin star that had been his mother's. It was the first time that star had seen the light of day in 15 years. As dusk fell, they bundled up and rode the sled into town for the evening church service. The windows of the small church glowed with lamplight, casting warm squares of light onto the snow. And standing at the entrance, leaning on a wooden cane, but standing on her own 2 feet, was Clara. She was finally out of the infirmary. The girls flew into her arms. "My beautiful girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at Zeke over their heads, her eyes shining. "You brought them." "They insisted on bringing the biscuits," he said, holding up a basket. "They made them themselves." Something was different that night. As they entered the church, there were no whispers, no sideways glances. People smiled. They called out greetings. Mrs. Peterson complimented the girls on their neat braids. The blacksmith's wife asked Clara how she was feeling, her voice full of genuine concern. The pastor himself came to greet them. "Please," he said, gesturing to the front pew, the one usually reserved for the town's most respected families. "Join us here." Zeke felt Clara stiffen beside him for a moment, then straighten her shoulders with a quiet dignity. They sat in the front pew, the twins nestled between them. As the familiar hymns filled the small church, Zeke looked at the three of them. Clara, Lydia, Lahi, and a feeling of profound, terrifying peace settled over him. This felt right. This felt like a family. After the service, as families gathered and shared Christmas treats, the pastor approached Zeke. "You've done well by them," he said quietly. "Anyone can see they're thriving in your care. The whole town sees it." Zeke just nodded, unable to find the words. He watched the girls laughing and confident, and for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future where this temporary arrangement became permanent, where the 60 days stretched into a lifetime. Later, they walked Clara to the small room she had rented above the seamstress's shop. The girls hugged her tightly, reluctant to let go. "You'll see me tomorrow," she promised. "Mr. Boone will bring you." "First thing," Zeke confirmed. As they rode home under a sky full of stars, the town glowing behind them, a deep joy filled Zeke. But beneath it, a cold sliver of fear remained. Happiness, this complete, felt fragile. He knew how quickly it could be shattered. He remembered the telegram. He remembered Clara's face. The joy of Christmas was real, but the threat, whatever it was just as real. It was out there, in the darkness, waiting. The morning after Christmas, the other shoe dropped. They were heading into town early, the sled packed with tools to help Clara move her things back to her homestead, when they saw him. A man in a polished bowler hat and a fine city coat stood waiting outside the seamstress's shop. He looked dangerously out of place in their rugged little town. As Clara stepped outside, the man moved forward, removing his hat with a slick, practiced motion. "Mrs. Dawes," his voice was smooth as oiled leather. "James Harlan. I represent the Western Railroad Company." He produced a leather folder. "I regret to inform you that your current deed claim is to be vacated. The railroad requires that land for a new depot." Zeke felt the twins go rigid beside him. "That's not possible," Clara said, her voice steady despite the shock. "My husband filed everything properly." "Ah," Harlan smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "But you see, mixed heritage claims filed under that particular territorial clause have recently been reviewed by our federal office. They have been deemed invalid." He let the word hang in the cold air. "A clerical error, you understand?" "That's a lie," Zeke started, swinging down from the sled. Harlan's eyes shifted to Zeke, cold and dismissive. "And I should mention," he continued, his gaze flicking meaningfully toward the girls, "that the county takes a dim view of temporary guardians who cannot provide stable housing for their wards. I would hate to see this unfortunate land dispute affect any pending custody arrangements." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a knife held to their throats. He was threatening to take her land and her children in one clean, brutal stroke. Clara swayed and Zeke moved to her side, his arm steadying her. The hopeful morning had turned into a nightmare. Harlan's smile never wavered. He had them trapped. The law, the money, the power, it was all on his side. And Zeke, a lone mountain man with two little girls and a woman who had just lost everything, had nothing. Nothing but a fire in his gut and a promise he'd made to himself. And he was starting to think that might have to be enough. The storm that hit that afternoon was as sudden and vicious as Harlan's threats. Snow came down in a blinding horizontal sheet, erasing the world and trapping them in the seamstress's small shop. Mrs. Peterson, a kind widow with sad eyes, insisted they all stay. She made up pallets for the twins near her stove, while Zeke and Clara sat in the stunned silence, watching the snow pile up against the windows. The day that had begun with such promise had curdled into despair. "We're not leaving Mama again, are we?" Lahi whispered as Zeke tucked them in, her voice trembling. "Not if I can help it," Zeke promised, the words feeling hollow even to him. Long after the girls slept, Zeke and Clara sat in the dim light of a single lamp. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. "He's lying," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "About the deed. Samuel, my husband, he was so careful. He knew people might challenge it one day. He said he had proof, papers that showed the land was rightfully his through his mother's people, long before any treaties were signed. He kept them, he said, to protect us." Zeke leaned forward, a flicker of hope igniting in the darkness. "Where are these papers, Clara?" Her face fell. That's the problem. He kept them in a small tin strongbox, hidden in our cabin. After he died, and I got sick, I never thought to look for it. With the snow and having to leave so quickly, it could still be there, or it could be lost forever. It was a sliver of a chance, but it was all they had. It took 2 days for the storm to blow itself out. As soon as the sun appeared, they began the journey to Clara's homestead. The snow was waist deep in places, and they had to clear 3 fallen pines from the path with Zeke's axe and a rope from the sled. Clara worked alongside him, her jaw set with a grim determination that belied her recent illness. The twins, seeing their mother's resolve, worked too, hauling smaller branches out of the way, their faces flushed with effort and cold. When they finally reached her cabin, it was half buried in a drift, a lonely shape against the vast white expanse. Inside, it was colder than the air outside, the silence profound. While Clara and the girls coaxed a fire to life in the frozen hearth, Zeke went to work. He didn't know where to start. He checked for loose floorboards, tapped on walls, searched the cold, empty shelves. It was Clara who found it. "Zeke," she called, her voice muffled. She was on her knees, reaching deep under the low frame of her bed. She pulled out a small, dusty tin box. The twins crowded around as she worked the rusty latch with trembling fingers. Inside, nestled among dried flowers and bundles of letters, was a thick, folded document sealed with wax. Clara carefully unfolded it. It was the original deed, but attached to it were other papers. A hand-drawn map, showing the land boundaries as they had been passed down through Samuel's Comanche ancestors, and a signed affidavit from a cavalry general acknowledging that Samuel's family had occupied the land peacefully for generations before the territory was even formed, granting them title in perpetuity beyond the reach of survey or treaty. It was more than a deed. It was irrefutable proof. Samuel had known. He had prepared for this fight. "This is it," Zeke breathed, relief washing over him in a powerful wave. "This is what we need." They stayed the night, huddled around the fire, the precious box between them. Clara told the girls stories about their father, his voice filling the small cabin with his memory. She told them how he loved the land, how he said its spirit sang to him. As the girls drifted to sleep, Zeke looked at Clara in the firelight. They were no longer just a man helping a woman in need. They were partners. They were a family, forged in crisis, and they were going to fight. The next morning, they walked into Judge Halbrook's office. Harlan was already there, spreading his official-looking railroad maps across the judge's desk. He smirked when they entered. The judge ignored him. "Mrs. Dawes, Mr. Boone." He took the documents Clara held out, adjusting his spectacles. He read them slowly, his expression unreadable. He held the affidavit up to the light, studying the watermark, the signature. The silence in the room was absolute. Harlan's smirk began to fade. Finally, the judge laid the papers on his desk. "Mr. Harlan," he said, his voice cold as a winter morning, "your company's claim, based on a federal review of territorial clauses, is noted." He paused, then picked up the cavalry affidavit. "However, this document predates the territory itself. It is a direct grant of title from the United States Army in recognition of services rendered by Samuel Dawes's father. It supersedes any subsequent territorial claim or federal review." He looked directly at Harlan. "The land belongs to Mrs. Dawes." Unequivocally. He wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he said, his gaze shifting to Zeke and the girls, who were holding their breath. "In light of Mr. Harlan's transparent and malicious attempt to use these children as leverage in a property dispute, I am making my temporary guardianship order permanent, effective immediately. Mr. Boone has proven himself a more than suitable father." He looked at Clara. "And it appears these children will soon have their mother back as well. A stable home, if I ever saw one." The air rushed out of Zeke's lungs. He looked at Lydia and Lahi. They launched themselves at him, their small arms wrapping around his neck, their joyful cries filling the dusty office. Clara was crying, silent tears of relief streaming down her face. Harlan, his face pale with fury, silently gathered his maps and stalked out of the office without a word. The fight was over. They had won. Spring came to the high country, slowly at first, then all at once. The snow retreated, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The creek thawed, its cheerful gurgle replacing the winter's silence, and on the Dawes homestead, life began anew. Zeke moved his few belongings from his lonely cabin into theirs. Together they repaired the roof, chinked the logs, and planted a garden in the plot Samuel had cleared years before. The town, having witnessed Harlan's defeat and the judge's ringing endorsement, changed its tune. Henderson, the rancher who had insulted them, showed up one day, hat in hand, with a gift of 2 laying hens. The baker's wife brought them a sourdough starter. The whispers had died, replaced by waves of greeting and offers of help. Zeke and Clara never spoke of marriage, not in words. There was no need. Their partnership was forged in the quiet rhythm of their days. They worked side by side, a comfortable silence between them that was more profound than any declaration. They were a family, a strange and wonderful unit brought together by fate in the fierce determination of 2 little girls. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, they all sat on the porch. The air was sweet with the smell of pine and damp earth. The twins were leaning against Zeke, their heads resting on his shoulders, their eyes heavy with sleep after a long day of helping in the garden. "You're coming with us," Lydia murmured, half asleep, quoting the words she'd spoken on that frozen trail months ago. "We need a daddy like you." Zeke's laugh rumbled deep in his chest. He pulled both girls closer, his heart feeling fuller than he had ever thought possible. "Guess I needed daughters like you, too," he said softly. Across the small space, Clara's eyes met his over the heads of her sleeping children. Her smile was gentle, and it held all the promises he would ever need. The fire that had once burned his life to the ground had left him with nothing but ash and solitude. He had thought that was his penance, his fate, but he was wrong. It had just been clearing the ground, clearing it for this, for a love he never expected, and a family that had, against all odds, chosen him. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I post new stories every single day, and the next one might be exactly what you need to hear.